If you're wanting to enter your sourdough era and you're just not quite sure how you can balance working a 9 to 5 and making your own bread, I am here to reassure you that you definitely can, and this is my timeline if I were to make bread working a 9 to 5. The first thing we need to do is feed our sourdough starter. For the recipe that I'm going to be making, I need 200 grams of starter. So I took my sourdough starter out of the refrigerator. Into a new jar, I added 75 grams of starter, 75 grams of unbleached bread flour, and 75 grams of water. You may need more or less water depending on the flour you use. You want it to be a thick pancake-like batter consistency. I'm choosing to feed my starter on a Friday night so I can make my dough Saturday. I did this right before I went to bed, so when I wake up in the morning, my starter will be ready to make my dough. I'm going to mix that up really well. That's the consistency we're going for. Thick pancake batter. This should not be runny. I'm going to cover that up and mark where it is so I can track and make sure that in the morning it's doubled in size. Side note, I found this new crew neck on TikTok Shop and I am obsessed. In my sourdough era, come on, so cute. Alright, it's the next morning and look at how perfectly beautiful this starter is. It more than doubled in size and we are ready to make some dough. I can tell it's ready because it's no longer domed on top, and you can see that spot right there where it's starting to fall back down. Now is the fun part. We are going to add 200 grams of that beautiful starter into our bowl, along with 700 grams of warm filtered water. Taking the bowl off the scale now, we're going to mix that up together to get a milky consistency. Next is our bread flour. We're going to add 1,000 grams of bread flour and 20 grams of salt. This recipe is for 2 loaves of sourdough, so if you're only wanting to make one, just take the grams, split them in half for every ingredient. Next, we're going to mix our dough together, trying not to fling it out of the bowl. I like to clean up the sides of the bowl and just make sure that there's no dry flour clumps in our dough. We're going to cover with a damp towel and let that rest for 1 hour. After the hour rest, it's time to do our stretch and folds. Stretch and folds build structure and strength to our dough, and they're very easy. All we do is go up underneath our dough, stretch towards us, fold it down in the middle, and quarter turn our bowl, and we do that on all 4 sides. To make sure that the dough doesn't stick to my hands, I keep either a bowl of water or a spray bottle right next to me, and I keep my hands wet all the way through my stretch and folds. We're going to do 4 total rounds of stretch and folds with 30 minutes in between each round. You should notice after each round that your dough is strengthening up and it smooths out a little bit as well. When we're done with our 4 rounds of stretch and folds, we're going to do something called bulk fermentation. We're just going to let our dough sit at room temperature to ferment. For beginners, this can be kind of confusing, but I tend to let it sit for about 4 to 5 hours on the counter. You'll know it's ready when it's almost doubled in size. It's very bubbly on the tops and the sides, and it's jiggly. When my dough is done bulk fermenting, I go right into shaping. Since this is a double batch, one of them I'm going to do plain, and the other I'm going to make dill and Havarti. I dump my dough out on a surface, and using my bench scraper, I cut it in half. You can weigh out your pieces to make sure they're even, but I just don't really find it necessary. My next step is putting this into a rectangle as far as I can get it to stretch without tearing. This one I'm going to add that cheese that I had cubed up and my fresh dill, and I'm just making sure I spread that evenly all throughout that rectangle. I fold the bottom part to the middle and the top part over that, and you can add more toppings as you like. We're going to roll this up into a log. As we get to the end of that log, we're going to start forming our dough into a ball. So we're going to get some tension in the top of our dough by doing these push-pull movements. Next up is my plain loaf, and I'm going to shape that the exact same way. Spreading the dough out into this rectangle adds even more strength and structure to our dough. You can see as I'm spreading it out that my dough is bubbly and airy, and that is a good sign. That's how you want it to be while you're shaping. Once again, I keep some water next to me if my dough feels like it's sticking to my hands too much. Using water will really help with that. But at this point, your dough should not be very sticky and unmanageable. To get a more structured loaf, I normally do a pre-shape and then a final shape, so I let this rest on the counter for about 30 minutes or so. Loaves with inclusions like this cheese one right here, most of the time they can't handle being shaped a second time, so I just use my bench scraper and kind of go around and tighten it up, and I put some rice flour on top and flip that face down into my banneton. I cover that and I start working on my plain loaf. After my dough is shaped, I do something called cold proofing. The shaped dough will go right into a banneton, covered, and go into the refrigerator for about 14 to 24 hours. This allows me to bake my loaves whenever I'm ready to do so. It gives the loaves a more complex flavor profile, and if you're more sensitive to gluten, this is a big benefit. It prolongs the fermentation of your loaf, so it'll break down more gluten, and you'll have less of a chance of overproofing your dough. So both of these loaves are going into the fridge overnight. I believe it was about 14 hours that I had these in the refrigerator. Now it's the next day and we're ready to score and bake our loaves. About 30 minutes before I took this out of the refrigerator, I put my Dutch ovens inside my oven and I preheated it to 450 degrees. I bake these both at the same time, but you can definitely do one after the other if you have one Dutch oven. You can even leave one in the fridge for a couple days and bake one with dinner. I bake these at 450 degrees for 30 minutes covered and 15 minutes uncovered. I immediately take these out and put them on a cooling rack and wait about an hour or two to slice them open. And now you have your own homemade bread for the rest of the week. Make sure to save this video for your next bake.